At exactly 10:17 on a bright Monday morning, a single father stood in the middle of a glass-walled office, while the most powerful woman in the company told him he was no longer worth keeping. Everyone around him expected him to apologize. They expected him to lower his head, beg for another chance, and promise that he would somehow become the employee they wanted. But instead, the exhausted father slowly removed his employee badge, placed it on the CEO's desk, and walked away without saying a word. What nobody in that room knew was that his decision would expose a secret that could cost the company millions, and completely change the life of the man they had just thrown away. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness, patience, and second chances can change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Dream Doll Tales. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this one to you. The man's name was Marlowe Bennett, a 38-year-old father who had learned how to survive without ever asking life to be fair. Every morning, before the sun had fully climbed above the buildings, Marlowe woke his 8-year-old daughter, Sable, prepared her breakfast, packed her school bag, and made sure the small lunchbox contained the one thing she always requested: apple slices with a little cinnamon. Their apartment was modest, with old furniture and a kitchen window that looked toward a busy street, but Marlowe had turned it into a home filled with warmth. Sable's mother had passed away several years earlier after a sudden illness, leaving Marlowe to raise their daughter alone. Since then, he had become father, mother, cook, cleaner, homework helper, nurse, and protector all at once. He never complained about it. He simply woke up every day and did what had to be done. Marlowe worked as a senior operations coordinator at a rapidly growing technology company called Veronese Group. The salary was not extraordinary, but it paid the rent, kept food on the table, and covered Sable's school expenses. Most importantly, the job came with health insurance. For a single father, that mattered more than a fancy title ever could. Marlowe was known for arriving early, staying late, and solving problems other employees avoided. He rarely took lunch breaks. Sometimes he ate a sandwich at his desk while checking spreadsheets. Sometimes he worked through headaches because missing a day could mean missing money his daughter needed. That Monday morning, however, everything began to fall apart. At 8:42, Marlowe received a message from Sable's school informing parents that an important electrical problem had forced the school to close unexpectedly for the day. His heart sank. He had no family nearby who could watch her, and the babysitter he occasionally relied on was unavailable. For a few seconds, he simply stared at his phone while the traffic moved around him. Then he made a choice that would later cost him his job. He called his supervisor, explained the situation, and asked if he could bring Sable to the office for a few hours. His supervisor reluctantly agreed, warning him that the CEO, Serafina Vale, was conducting an important review that morning. Marlowe arrived with Sable just after 9. He settled her quietly in a small unused conference room with coloring books and headphones while he rushed into the operations department. His work was already waiting. A major client shipment had been delayed, a supplier had entered incorrect figures into the system, and 3 departments were blaming one another. Marlowe moved from desk to desk trying to repair the damage. By 9:50, he had almost stabilized everything. Then Sable came running toward him. Her face was pale, and she was holding her stomach. Marlowe immediately forgot about the spreadsheets. He crouched beside her and realized she had developed a fever. She was trembling slightly, and her little hands were unusually warm. Fear rushed through him. He called the school nurse, then the pediatric clinic, but the earliest appointment was several hours away. He knew he had to take his daughter home. Before he could leave, an assistant appeared and told him that Serafina Vale wanted to see him immediately. Marlowe entered the executive conference room carrying Sable in his arms. The room was filled with senior managers sitting around a long table. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with brilliant daylight, making the polished table shine. At the far end sat Serafina, a woman known throughout the company for her intelligence, discipline, and ruthless standards. She looked at Marlowe, then at the sick child in his arms, and her expression hardened. The meeting had been delayed because of an operations report Marlowe was responsible for. He tried to explain, but Serafina was already furious. The report contained several errors, and she had been told that the mistakes were causing confusion across the company. What she did not know was that Marlowe had not created those errors. Someone else had altered the figures after he submitted the report. Serafina stood, looked directly at him, and said that the company could not continue carrying people who were unable to handle pressure. Her voice was cold as she told him that if he could not handle the job, she would replace him. The words landed harder than Marlowe expected. He looked around the room and saw several managers avoiding his eyes. For years, he had sacrificed everything to keep that job. He had missed birthdays. He had worked while sick. He had stayed awake until midnight preparing reports, so that other people could leave on time. He had never asked for special treatment. Yet now, because his daughter was sick and because someone else had manipulated his work, he was being treated like a burden. Something inside Marlowe finally broke. He gently placed Sable's bag over his shoulder, removed his company badge, walked toward Serafina's desk, and placed it on the polished surface. There was no shouting, no dramatic argument, no begging. He simply looked at the badge for a moment and realized that it represented years of giving everything to people who had forgotten he was human. Then he walked out. The entire room went silent. Outside the building, the bright afternoon sun seemed almost painfully beautiful. Cars moved along the street, people hurried past carrying coffee cups, and somewhere a street musician played a soft melody. Marlowe carried Sable toward the bus stop, holding her close as she rested her feverish head against his shoulder. He had no job. He had rent due in 12 days. He had medical bills waiting. And he had no idea what he would tell his daughter that night. Yet for the first time in years, he felt strangely free. What Marlowe didn't know was that his resignation had triggered something unexpected inside the company. Later that afternoon, Serafina requested the original operations files. She wanted to understand exactly how Marlowe had allowed so many mistakes to reach her desk. But when the files were opened, something did not make sense. The timestamps showed that the numbers had been changed after Marlowe had submitted the final report. Serafina ordered the technology department to investigate. They discovered that someone had accessed Marlowe's account shortly after midnight. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. The altered figures were not random mistakes. They were designed to make one particular supplier appear more reliable than it actually was. Millions of dollars in upcoming contracts were connected to that supplier. Suddenly, Marlowe's report looked completely different. He had not failed. Someone had deliberately made him look incompetent. Meanwhile, Marlowe was sitting in a small clinic with Sable beside him. Her fever was beginning to come down, but he could barely focus on anything except the future. When the doctor said she would be fine with rest and medication, relief nearly brought him to tears. That evening, Marlowe made dinner while Sable sat at the kitchen table coloring a picture of the two of them. She looked up and asked whether he was still going to work the next morning. Marlowe paused. He smiled and told her that sometimes people leave places that no longer appreciate them. Sable looked at him for a moment, and then said that maybe something better was waiting. Those simple words stayed with him. The next morning, Marlowe woke before sunrise, but instead of putting on his company suit, he opened an old laptop and began searching for work. He updated his resume, contacted former colleagues, and applied for positions. He was terrified, but he refused to let fear become his daughter's inheritance. By noon, his phone rang. It was Serafina Vale. Marlowe almost ignored the call. He finally answered. Serafina's voice was completely different from the day before. There was no anger, no arrogance, only something that sounded dangerously close to regret. She told him that the investigation had uncovered evidence proving that his report had been altered after submission. She admitted that she had judged him before knowing the truth. Marlowe listened quietly. Then she offered him his job back. But Marlowe surprised her. He thanked her, but he refused. For years, he had believed that keeping a job meant holding on no matter how badly he was treated. Now he understood that sometimes walking away was not weakness. Sometimes it was the first act of self-respect a person could give himself. Serafina asked what he wanted instead. Marlowe looked across the room at Sable, who was drawing beside the window in the warm afternoon sunlight. He said that he wanted a workplace where employees could be treated like human beings. He wanted flexibility for parents. He wanted managers to investigate before blaming. He wanted people to understand that an employee could be hardworking and still have a sick child waiting at home. There was a long silence. Then Serafina asked him to come back, not as an employee, but as someone who could help change the company. Weeks later, Marlowe returned to Verone's group under completely different circumstances. He was offered a leadership position overseeing employee operations and workplace support. One of his first recommendations was a family emergency policy that allowed parents to handle genuine emergencies without fearing immediate punishment. Another was a confidential reporting system for employees who believed their work had been manipulated or unfairly blamed. The investigation eventually identified the person responsible for altering Marlowe's files. The supplier relationship was terminated before the company suffered the millions of dollars in losses that could have followed. But the biggest change happened inside Serafina herself. She began walking through the departments instead of staying behind her office doors. She learned employees' names. She listened to their problems. She discovered that the people she had once considered numbers were actually fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, caregivers, and people carrying invisible struggles into work every morning. One sunny afternoon, months after Marlowe had walked away, Serafina saw him standing near the office entrance with Sable. His daughter was holding a drawing she had made for the company's family day. Serafina looked at the little girl and smiled. Sable handed her the drawing. It showed a tall building under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom stood 3 figures holding hands. Marlowe, Sable, and Serafina. Underneath, in crooked handwriting, were the words, "People can change." Serafina stared at those words for a long moment. Then she looked at Marlowe and realized something she had failed to understand on that terrible Monday morning. She had thought she was firing a weak employee. Instead, she had pushed away a strong man who had spent years carrying responsibilities nobody else could see. And when he walked away, he didn't lose everything. He finally discovered his worth. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear that walking away from disrespect is not always giving up, and subscribe to Dream Doll Tales for more stories about courage, kindness, and second chances. And before we end, I have one special request. Comment, "I choose kindness." If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, especially when they are fighting battles we cannot see. Because sometimes the person standing quietly in front of us is carrying an entire world on their shoulders. We may never know how many times they have smiled while breaking inside, how many sacrifices they have made without applause, or how many mornings they have gotten out of bed simply because someone they love was depending on them. Marlowe walked away from that office thinking he had lost his future. But sometimes, life closes one door not to punish us, but to force us toward a door we were too afraid to open. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can say is not a word at all. Sometimes it is simply the courage to walk away.